Hey everyone, I'm Tony Boutagy, and welcome to the Stronger with Time podcast, where we explore what it takes for women to train, perform, and feel at their best across all phases of life. In today's episode, I speak with Professor Paul Laursen. Dr. Laursen is an exercise physiologist, high-performance coach, and the co-author of the definitive textbook on interval training. Paul conducted his PhD in high-intensity interval training at the University of Queensland in Australia. He is the former head of physiology for New Zealand Olympic athletes and an adjunct professor of exercise physiology at the Auckland University of Technology. He's currently the co-founder and CEO of HIIT Science, the co-founder and head of product for Athletica, and the co-host of the Training Science podcast. Professor Laursen is a world-renowned specialist in endurance training, high-intensity interval training, nutrition, heart rate variability, thermal physiology, health, and artificial intelligence. In today's episode, we explored the intricacies of cardiovascular training for females, the role of carbohydrate in the diet, especially as we age, exercising in the fasted state, the popularity of Zone 2 training, and of course, high-intensity interval training, which Paul is regarded as one of the world's foremost experts. It's not a stretch to say that the vast majority of knowledge that I have and use with my clients around interval training has come from the work Paul has done in this field. So it was a real pleasure to have this conversation with such a coaching luminary. So without further delay, please enjoy this episode with Professor Paul Laursen. Paul, thank you for joining me.
Tony, it's an honor, man. Thanks for having me.
I think this is a space where we think about endurance training, aerobic training, and performance. And you and I have both come from sports science backgrounds and coaches of athletes. But what often is missed is the role of aerobic exercise, endurance exercise, and health. And you've certainly made a turn over the last few years, I would say, from performance to the impact on your health. So what made that transition for you from being a coach and scientist, a renowned coach of athletes, to having a more health insight and approach?
Yeah, well, it came from directly hanging out with young endurance phenoms in the New Zealand Olympic program. And you get close with the athletes and the coaches, and you make relationships, and you make these observations that, as Phil and I wrote, that these athletes may be very incredibly fit, but not necessarily healthy. And in terms of the actions and stuff that they perform away ultimately often from the training itself. So it really sort of evolved there in the Olympic organization much to my sort of surprise, even though these athletes looked bronze and fit and muscular, on the inside, they were kind of breaking down a little bit. So that's kind of where it all started.
And what was the indications? Because you're right, when we see the world's best endurance athletes, and you've worked with triathletes and cyclists and runners and rowers and a whole lot more, what was the telltale signs that these people might be training 30, 40 hours a week, but might actually not be healthy?
Yeah, it kind of came down to a lot of the overtraining syndrome. We kind of put it in a bucket there, right? But just really poor sleeping, miserable, unhappy ultimately on the inside, and injuries, poor metabolic health too, right? Like even you eventually start to see like the metabolic profile tests, those start to kind of take a dive as well. So there's just until the athlete finally kind of takes a pause and relaxes and rests. But that's sort of where you see it. It doesn't really appear right, like a red light right off the bat. It sort of slowly manifests and gets worse over time, in my experience.
Let's talk more about metabolic health. And it's one of these aspects of fitness that take for granted. And I think resistance training over the last several years has now reached prime time. And there's a strong emphasis on lifting weights for your muscle and your bone, especially as we age. And the idea of training to improve your VO₂max or your metabolic health is often forgotten. So what are the differences that you see from the benefits we get from lifting weights versus the benefits we do from endurance aerobic training? Why would you prescribe either one or the other?
Yeah, I don't think I think both are really important. I guess I wear a holistic hat on the topic in that you need to have a balance, either whoever you are, you need to have a balance of both. And then, of course, different degrees of one or the other, depending on what your aims are and whatnot. But yeah, you ultimately lifting, eventually working up towards being able to lift heavy is just this key parameter to have maintain your muscle mass. And of course, we always say context before content. So there's 1,000 contexts in this whole topic, right? But in general, you want to be able to lift heavy things just for getting around in the world. And then also that kind of goes hand in hand with having a large amount of muscle mass. Muscle is a metabolic tissue, and it actually, you require a lot of energy kind of to run it. So if you have a good degree of muscle, it winds up being your metabolic rate high just naturally, because it's a metabolically active tissue. But then, of course, on the other end, you can't just have your weight training, strength training. You need to be moving aerobically as well, because heart and mitochondria are vital components as well. So you got to keep that other low intensity energy metabolism moving along zone 2 training or below. That's really important for burning fat ultimately, and getting mitochondria that burn fat for you. And all of this drives all of the other systems in the body. Again, back to the holistic area that we started, the healthy athlete, all of that, causes the immune system to function optimally, which keeps control of all the health issues and keeps you healthy and feeling good in a good circadian rhythm. And so I blabbed on a little bit there.
Yeah, and let's talk more about mitochondria. And recent studies have compared resistance training versus aerobic training. And the conclusion is that aerobic training provides a more potent stimulus for mitochondria. So how do we measure these things? If we are the general public and we want to improve our health, how do you know if you're improving mitochondria? How do you measure metabolic health? Is it a blood test? Is there a performance metric? So how do you track it with your clients?
Yep. It's a great question, and I can imagine that the layperson's they're unclear in terms of how they go and figure this out for themselves. And wearing my Athletica hat on, that's the AI training platform that helped pioneer with my team. And it's ultimately what we look at in there is your power output, or your running pace, or your movement pace, ultimately swimming, running, rowing, relative to your heart rate at what we would call your MAF, or your maximal aerobic fitness heart rate. And you can generally gauge that as, and this is very ballpark, but it generally tends to work as in a formula 180 minus your age. This is pioneered by Phil Maftone, a colleague of mine who started me on the whole healthy athlete thing, or healthy versus unhealthy athlete thing. But you can ultimately, this is your fat burning intensity, and you can, irrespective of the exercise mode that you are most familiar with, you can determine what that is, and then you can work from there. So maybe you want to be, if you have a lot of mitochondria, you're one of those individuals, and those mitochondria are good at burning fat. Usually the two go hand in hand. You're holding your pace or power at that MAF heart rate, and it's not falling down too much. Conversely, and this often happens when individuals begin a program with anyone, and they start with the challenge of, let's see how long I can hold my MAF heart rate at whatever pace or power they want. And it's not very long often in some individuals that pace is just really dropping fast, or conversely, if they're maintaining a constant pace, that heart rate is going skyward. And that's a clear sign that they could do better with their lifestyle ultimately, that's contributing to their ability to burn fat. So yeah, does that answer a little bit your question,
And I
Tony?
think the irony is where people view exercise as harder is better, have an approach that what we do in the weights room where you work to or very close to failure, every aerobic session should be as hard as possible. And that is, I've got 30 minutes or an hour, and I'm going to make the most of that. And that's where interval sessions or threshold sessions. But this ability to run at lower heart rates and keep your constant pace, it's a forgotten skill. And I know that when I've had clients who've certainly come from an interval background and you run them at 180 minus your age, they run extremely slowly, and B, their heart rate skyrockets. So would I be right in thinking using a power meter on a bike or running speed, if we worked out 180 minus your age, warmed them up and said run for 5Ks or work out your watts, how long would you have them on a bike for to test maximum aerobic function, or would you do 5Ks if they were running? So how would you use this for the general public?
Yeah, so we do this right on Athletica too. So you can sign up for a free trial and just test this out yourself. And we also have the Athletica Kickstarter as well, which is a 100% free training plan that uses all these different training plans, these concepts. And what we do, you go on there and you start. Let's use the cycling context because it's the easiest to understand. But basically, we do 30 minutes at your MAF power output. If you had a power meter, or you could use a bike with a constant power. And so say that's say you're 40 and that's 140 beats a minute. So you would hold 140 beats per minute and then you'd watch the power output. And that usually falls pretty fast in people when they're starting this and they haven't got the background. Conversely, if we look at the very fit individuals, those that are winning some of the Ironman races, etc., they're just, that power and heart rate is locked right in. And what that means is if it's locked right in, that means that fat is fully supporting that power output, that relatively low power output. And that is ultimately that's usually like the zone 2 exercise intensity. And it means everything can be fueled on that. And you can imagine the power of yourself in all other aspects of your life if you're able to do that. Conversely, usually when people are just starting out with this, that power is dropping or the heart rate's going skyward, as you were mentioning, right? And you can do this in the running context as well. You could be doing laps on the track at that heart rate. And again, that's usually if you're following the heart rate and locking it in, the pace will drop dramatically. Usually in the first time with most people, they'll start to go to a walk. They'll have to go to a walk to keep their heart rate right at 140 beats per minute. And we get so many complaints ultimately. It's like, I can't do this. This just seems all wrong. But and then they go slow first. And then lo and behold, after a good given amount of time, and sometimes a lifestyle adjustment as well with potentially improved nutrition, better sleep habits, etc. And this whole holistic approach tends to create a healthy athlete. And they're so thrilled and happy when they can all of a sudden run at a low heart rate. That's just such an accomplishment for them. They're just so thrilled. And we hear about it. And it's fantastic. And it changes the game for them. And their performance just goes through the roof thereafter.
I can remember, and I think it was your colleague Phil Maffetone who talked about his work with Mark Allen. And when he introduced this, I think from memory, he was doing 6 or 7 minute kilometer pace at that heart rate. And then by the end, when he was on his multiple year streak wins, it was down into 3-something minute kilometers.
Correct.
At that low heart rate. So
correct. Yeah, close to 320s he was doing at that heart rate.
Okay. Just astonishing for anyone to ever think that you could run that fast, fueled on fat at such low intensities.
Yeah, because let's even back the truck up. Let's figure out why is that the case? Why is that so powerful? If you can do your entire Ironman with fat at 320 pace. Remember, fat on all of us, even in the leanest individual, is unlimited in terms of its fuel reserves. Whereas carbohydrate, stored glycogen, stored liver, blood glucose, that is a finite resource. And that'll deplete quite quickly. Bonking, or so-called hitting the wall in sport, is associated with that hypoglycemic response, and the brain collapses ultimately, and you can't go forward because you haven't been able to switch the fuel sources by keeping stress low, getting rid of the no pain, no gain mentality, and doing the easy stuff easy, or making the incredible easy. And that's what regular training and good lifestyle does.
So 2 more questions on zone 2, and then we'll actually explore what those zones are. Do you have a metric that you would say if you're at 140 beats a minute, 180 minus your age, and you're doing watts on the bike, is there a watts per kilogram that you would have as a goal for an individual?
Not really, no, because it depends on the context, right? It depends on the individual, right? It's going to be different for an elite cyclist versus a 70-year-old age group athlete, right? So it's just not necessarily a watts per kilo goal. You just do what, you do what you can do thing.
Right. Mitochondria is identified as a longevity target. Recent data on mitochondria and brain shows that those who've got high mitochondrial content stave off dementia and Alzheimer's. Is this something that you've got a target per week for the general public who aren't athletes? If you're giving a prescription for mitochondria, how many minutes, how many hours would that be at those lower intensities?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's, I'm sure there are overall organization guidelines. I think you generally want to do as much as you can that's reasonable within the busy work lives and social lives that we all sort of lead. But it's probably not a great answer. Like, I'm not sure what they're recommending. You'd probably know more than me, whether it's 30 times, 3 times a week or something. But to me, that's a very minimal. Like, you want to be moving the body. Humans were meant to move. I think, gosh, I like it when individuals can get probably upwards of 6 to 10 hours a week as a minimum.
Okay. And I
That's
think
that, but it's not reasonable for everyone.
but with experts like yourself, and Peter Attia has been very vocal in the amount of hours at zone 2. And I think his recommendations are north of 5 hours.
Yeah.
And I think most general public would struggle to even get an hour because I don't think they realize the importance of low intensity, because it's either all interval training or it's resistance training, and this idea that doing low intensity work is of any benefit because it doesn't hurt. And I think that's a mentality that we really need to dissuade the public from buying into, because this low intensity work is such a potent builder of mitochondria.
Yeah, you said it exactly. So it's difficult to come on publicly sometimes and say that, but that is, if we're caring about health, wellness, longevity, lifespan, health span, Peter's right. Like, it should be higher than 5 in the week. That should be the basic minimum. And again, that was why I was moving more towards I'd like to see around the 6 to 10 kind of thing. And that's usually where people are entering in on Athletica as well. That's usually when they're coming in there. It's like, okay, I want to get the prescription for that. The low volume, the base plan. And that's usually sort of where it starts, in that 6 to 10 hour bandwidth. And it doesn't have to be hard. And I know we're all busy individuals, but especially if you have a bike, there's quite a bit of multitasking you can do whilst you're on a bike, whether it's listening to a podcast that's specific to your work, being on your phone and whatnot while you do that if you have to. Of course, even better if you can let your mind drift in the outdoors and be outside, because we get so much from being out in nature too, right? But all of that stuff goes towards the goal that you're talking about, Tony, and that is building more mitochondria.
And that's certainly my approach in the week. If I'm doing work, i.e. aerobic work, I'm multitasking and doing reading, listening. On the weekends, I'll get out in nature, and that's the time to go a bit longer, enjoy nature, converse with other human beings. Let's talk about zone training. And this term zone 2, very popular. There's debate about zone 2. Should females do zone 2? Is it the best use of time? There's misunderstandings and there's pushback. It's an irrelevant zone. Let's take a big step back. What are the zones of training? You can see 3 zones that physiologists use, 5 zones that you've used in your textbook, more than 7 zones for rowers and cyclists. What would the general public, how do you make sense of the zones? What are they doing in each different zone? So this is an area of your expertise. So let's dive deeply into the different zones of training.
Sure. Let's start where we have started already, and let's start on the zone 2 cutoff. And the fortunate thing about that cutoff is it does have a physiological landmark, and that is your first ventilatory threshold, or your aerobic threshold, or your lactate threshold. So we can actually measure that in a lab using a metabolic cart. And we can actually see there's changes that happen in the amount of lactate that's ultimately all of a sudden produced and the resulting amount of carbon dioxide that's produced as well. And then there's a trigger. We call it the ventilatory threshold because the ventilation all of a sudden increases slightly at that point to get rid of that carbon dioxide. That's the role of the respiratory system. It's one of the key buffer systems that's in the body. So this is cool. And again, when we went back to that MAF heart rate, we're not measuring, in a laboratory, this heart rate, but it's around that point, right? You got a ballpark, and not everyone has the resources to go into the laboratory and actually pinpoint that. But that's generally where we're talking. That's the cutoff between zone 2 and zone 3 in the 5-zone model. Now, again, to go all over the place, we're not measuring, in a laboratory. Kind of like you said, there's actually just 3 zones, and that's like the easy training, and that's below the zone 2 that we just talked about, the ventilatory threshold. So that's the basement, that's the fat burning zone. Then there's this other zone cutoff from the physiological standpoint that we often term, it's got a bunch of different terms, but it can be called like critical power, critical pace, maximal lactate steady state, VT2, the second ventilatory threshold. It's kind of like your race pace. So if you're a fairly mid-level pack athlete and you can do like a 5K race, or you might be able to do a 20 or a 40K time trial on the bike, it's kind of that pace. It's that really hard, all out, I'm going for it for this race. And that's generally the pace that you're sort of talking about here for critical power, critical pace. And that is the cutoff between what we term between zone 4, actually zone 3 and zone 4. So, and again, so now zone 3 or mid zone is kind of no man's land. And if we look at other famous physiologists like Steven Seiler, he's told us that it's really good to kind of do a generally polarized training model where you do the bulk of your training in that zone 2 or below, the fat burning zone, and then do a little bit of training in your upper zones. You were talking about that before, Tony, where you're talking about the going and doing the HIIT training and these sorts of things. Do 10 to 20% of your training in that zone, and then be careful about doing all mid-zone training. And that's what people tend to do when they go out for an aerobic training run. They just tend to bomb it in the mid-zone area, and that's just what that winds up being like from a physiological standpoint is just sort of hard training all the time. And that winds up being overall more stressful than if you were to just go for a nice stroll and a walk kind of thing, and then just only doing smaller bits of training in that upper zone 4 and above. Now, I've kind of been all over the map. So now so we've got physiological zones, and then we've got the 5-zone model. So one is really easy. One's like walking and jogging. 2 is like steady, easy talk test. 3 is the mid zone. We only want to do so much training in there, generally speaking. Zone 4 is your threshold training, like your race pace training. Zone 5, now we're starting to get into the HIIT training, and like we call this long intervals or VO₂max training. That's zone 5. And then you can even do sort of shorter intervals up in the zone 6 area. And those can actually be very effective if you are in a balanced, healthy, polarized model. So yeah, physiological zones.
Yeah.
5-zone model, 7-zone model, kind of just like you said. There's a whole bunch of things there. If you, again, to plug Athletica, if you just want to come on in, you've got a wearable, go try the free 2-week trial, and you'll have presto. You'll have your zones will be presented to you, and you will see exactly what they are based on your wearable history. Or you could do a bunch of little tests, and you can actually have your zones shown to you.
But that's an amazing discussion with lots for us to follow some rabbit holes there. For somebody who is busy and incorporating resistance training but has committed every day to exercise, my approach has been to spend more time in zone 2 because it's easy to recover from. You can multitask, with a little bit of time in zone 4 and 5 using HIIT training. I do virtually no work in zone 3 because in terms of time investment, recovery, reward. It's just not there. Would you see the world similarly if you're lifting, say, 3 or 4 days a week?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, especially like with the goals that you're mentioning. Yeah, the only context where zone 3 becomes relevant is if you're actually training for events that are in zone 3, such as half marathons, Ironman, half Ironman type events. Then zone 3 becomes very relevant because that's actually where the event is performed. So that principle of specificity, you would all of a sudden do that. But that's, yeah, different context.
Absolutely. So let's talk about HIIT training, which ironically is where you're most widely known. You've authored the major textbook on high intensity interval training. I have the very same book on the shelves behind me. And this is where I first became aware of you in early 2000s. Perhaps you did your PhD in interval training with David Jenkins, and you were exploring this interval training volume, intensity, what gave the best improvements in performance. And for a young coach like myself, I devoured this research. It was very helpful in learning how to prescribe better intervals for my clients. And then this long-awaited book came out, published by Human Kinetics, and you have a platform to help people understand interval training. You, more than anyone else, has shaped my understanding on the different targets of interval training, the difference between long, short sprint, and the different work-rest ratios you can have when doing short interval training. And my experience in the general public is that long intervals work very well for athletes who've got the fitness and capacity to do a 3 or 4 minute VO2 interval. But this on-off, 30 on, 30 on, 15 off, I learned almost everything that I use with clients from you and your work. So let's really dive into the short interval protocols. And firstly, how do you know what intensity to do them at? And what are you trying to accomplish when you're breaking a 4-minute interval into 20 on, 10 off, or vice versa? This is your area. So tell us all about short intervals.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks, Tony. And it is a bit of a tricky one in terms of like knowing what to do these at, and keep things at the layperson level. But ultimately, if I can geek out for just a moment, the reason why the short interval works nice is because of this physiological protein that we have in our muscles, and it's called myoglobin. And it's like the hemoglobin in your blood. It's like the hemoglobin of the muscle. And when you take that pause between short breaks, between work hard for 30 minutes and then work hard for 30 seconds and then rest for 30 seconds, that 30-second pause or rest in the muscles, it basically, that myoglobin quickly resaturates all of the oxygen, and that keeps the actual stress fairly at bay. So that's why the work pause short can be very effective. But of course, there's great bang for buck with this as well. We talked about mitochondria. You make incredible mitochondria in your fast twitch muscle fibers, and they're activated too, which keeps them going in your life. So from a health and longevity standpoint, that's super valuable because those are becoming senescent. They're going to sleep on us as we age. We don't want that to happen. We want to keep those alive. I do exactly like you do, Tony. From my HIIT sessions, really very biased to focusing on short interval work, typically 30-30s. I find 30-30s great. And it's because they wind up being a lot less stressful than something like a longer interval, 4 on, 4 off kind of thing. That's great for what we call so-called diesel engines, those that are just gifted ultimately in having a higher percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers. But that's not the majority of us. The majority of us are hybrid athletes, but where we have a balance of slow and fast twitch. And we tend to be better with the short interval one that you're talking about. So little sets of 30 on, 30 off.
I've found that to be overwhelmingly true in the population that I see, unless, of course, they're 10K runners, triathletes, diesel engines, and they just thrive on repeats of multiple minutes. Let's explore how to find the intensity of these interval protocols. When we all went through university, the only thing we really had was long intervals. We'd run kilometers, run miles, and we would get our heart rate up to 90% of maximum, and we'd try and hold it there. But with rowers and bikes and GPS, we can now monitor our velocity or power pretty accurately. If you're telling me to go and run 30/30s, how do we know where to dial it in, assuming that we've got, say, watts?
Yeah. Sorry to keep plugging our platform, but hey, it's free anyway. So just honestly go, if you've got a wearable system, and I'm talking something like the Garmin system is ideal, could be a Polar system, Chorus, Sunto, anything that hooks up to to Strava, etc. You can basically connect the thing, and you could do like a couple all-out tests, and from that, you actually you very quickly we develop something that we call a power or pace profile. And this is like a fundamental principle that's in exercise science. And it's basically, you're looking at how hard can you go for short durations and how long can you go for long durations, and what's the associated power of this. And this was one of our forefathers of exercise science. A.V. Hill was the first to describe this, but it's a fundamental principle. So you sort of want to know that. And if you have that, you have your zones. And that's what we use within Athletica. So you basically you can actually see right there and then where that what we would call zone 6 training is. That's the target that you sort of want to go for. So for me, and we do these all the time on a collaborative platform that's called Velocity, and it's an online medium where you can do your bikes and runs in a coaching live medium sort of thing, which is pretty cool. But in those, for me, I'm doing mine right now, my 30/30s. I'm doing mine between 320 and 360 watts. I don't know if that watts don't mean anything, but you get that output. It's above my VO₂max work. It's above my zone 5. So my VO₂max or long interval pace is about sitting around 300. So it's just a little bit above that. But that's okay, because remember, there's pauses between it all. So I'm only up there for 30 seconds and then I'm down and I'm resting. And even the very first one always doesn't feel like anything. It's just, oh yeah, no problem. But lo and behold, after you're doing these repeatedly, you're breathing really hard. And sure enough, it's a VO₂max workout. By the end, like you do 6 or 7 of these in repeats, the whole respiratory system is definitely engaged. Heart rate's sitting up. For me, I'm sitting up around 160 to 170 beats a minute. As an old guy, that's relatively high for me.
And how many would you do in a series? And
Yep.
then would you do them in blocks into another block? Or are you just one and done? You just do that for one session?
Yeah, so it totally depends on your progression, right? When I start with these, I would just do 1 or 2 sets of, say, 5 or 6 30/30s, right? Sets of it. So 30 on times 30 off times 6, right? Or 5 to start. Do that twice with maybe the recovery interval in between might be anywhere between 2 and 5 minutes, depending on where you're at. And then progress those up. So now I'm working mine through, and we're doing like 5 or 6 of those sets. And so it just totally depends on where you're at in the progression spectrum. But one of the key principles that we always tell all of our athletes that join us on Athletica and Velocity, remember to pull the plug when you need to develop the feel to knowing when enough is enough. Then always remember that the next session is the most important session. So that's the key principle, right? Because training consistency over anything else that you and I speak on here today, Tony, is the most important thing. That repeated signal, that repeated stimulus in your body to tell your body, no, we got to keep going. We got to keep going. We are here on this planet to work. We are here on this planet to move our bodies and keep our physiology up there. And it's never going to happen in the no pain, no gain context or philosophy, because it's one and done. It's like everything, it's all out, and now I'm dead for 5 days thereafter. And then the body forgets everything, and it's just a terrible system.
That's really well said. And that's the overwhelming viewpoint in the fitness industry, is that you do need to go to that point of task failure, and holding that 1 rep in the tank or more so that you know when to stop is a skill that I imagine most don't have, but is often something you just don't hear about.
Oh, yeah, absolutely right. No, I know. It's the biggest thing that we teach. Yeah, and it's the biggest thing that people appreciate too once they finally get it. because they go next level when they do. They're like, they finally get it. It's like, oh, that's what real training's all about. It changes their life and it's beautiful.
So two follow-up questions. VO₂max, all this work is improving our heart's capacity to pump blood around the body. How much work do you need to do to meaningfully improve your VO₂max?
Yeah, that's a tough one too. Like, how long's a piece of string? One of those questions, right? Like, it's you just, anytime you're giving your body the signal or the stimulus, you're telling it to improve its VO₂max. Now, VO₂max is, as Peter Attia has done a great job of doing, is promoting, it's one of the key, if not the key indicators of your health and longevity, right? But and there's many different, I guess, pinch points, we might call it, along the pathway of oxygen uptake. So what is oxygen uptake? It's the maximal ability to breathe in, take in oxygen from our environment, ventilate the lungs. So there's the first pinch point. Take it into the blood. There's the second pinch point. Grab it into the heart and allow the heart to pump that. There's the other most important pinch point. And then saturate, though generally the tissues of the body, but in the exercise context, that's mostly the muscle cells and the mitochondria that we've been talking about. So there's really 4 key sort of areas that you can work on in terms of your VO₂max training, but heart is the most important one, that pumping action. We know that the heart is key, but anything you do along that cascade to enhance any of those things, your ventilation, your blood volume. We know that heat training, say for example, sauna, even being in the heat of Australia in summertime, this is all beneficial to expanding blood volume. Any of the work that we're talking about with that's going to elevate the heart rate, increase the cardiac output, and then any work that we're actually doing to tell our muscles to make more mitochondria in the muscle cells. It's all going to be working along that cascade of enhancing VO₂max, and therefore, by surrogate, your health and longevity.
And is there a minimum time that you would accumulate in those upper zones 5 and 6 to know I've done enough work to send that signal? Because some might do 5-6 minutes of intervals, but by the time their heart actually gets up there, it might actually not be a stimulus for adaptation. And I know numbers like 10 plus minutes around VO₂max have been thrown around. Would you have a target for the general public to know that was a quality session to do what it was meant to do?
Yeah, good one. It's a really similar answer almost where we started with the zone 2 thing, where it's the general recommendation for the population is probably, I think it's 150 hard minutes in the week or something like that. And I know that because my Garmin watch tells me that, right? And I think that's based on public health guidelines. So I want 150 minutes of hard training in my week, however we measure it. But again, I think always in general, we want to try to be above these things if we can. And yeah, so it's how many of these little short interval sessions or others like that, vigorous exercise, can we put into ourselves in that week? Again, of course, keeping stress controlled too, right? Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit more than that 150. And I don't know, like 150 of VO₂max work, that would be off a whole lot as well too. But it's probably kind of a blend of those upper zones sort of thing. Probably actually the mid zone and above, you're probably looking for more than 150 minutes of exercise in those upper ranges. But again, don't lose sight of the importance, as we talked about before, of that solid base, right? Probably above, like we said, 5 hours of zone 2.
Oh, what would the training history be doing zone 2 work before you started to incorporate high intensity interval training? Would you do it concurrently? Would you wait 6 months? What is your general prescription?
Yeah, again, these are really hard contextual questions because it depends on the person sitting in front of us. But regardless, you want to have that first. You want to have that base training first. So I'm actually creating this Athletica.ai course on Athletica. It's part of being an Athletica member is you get this course. Lecture 1 just happens to be base training. So it's so fundamental. And we know that Ingvild Auden, I interviewed her on the Training Science podcast. She did this really cool study in Norway for her PhD, where she was and she's at one of these Norwegian schools where they can measure every single session on all of their cyclists that are in these schools on a VO₂max cart. So she had every single session, like just crazy world over there. I'm actually just about to fly over and have a chat with them, which I can't wait to see it. But what she showed so clearly was that in her latest HIIT study, where she was looking at HIIT adaptation, she basically she showed that cyclists in her study that adapted to the high intensity interval training, the only ones that adapted, the ones that had substantial or significant zone 2, zone 1 training. So they had the base under them. Those that didn't have the zone 1 and zone 2, they just stayed the same. That there's something about this adaptation energy and that base training that you need to make sure that the HIIT training actually works for you. So that's pretty cool.
No surprises there when you look at the training logs of very successful endurance athletes, whether it's a Mark Allen or European cyclists. They would spend significant months of time developing that metabolic machinery before they would do intensity work. Speaking of the Norwegians, and I really enjoyed that episode, and they've done a lot of gender work, seeing how males and females respond. You've worked with both genders at the very highest level over many Olympic cycles. Do you see a difference in the gender response to aerobic training, to zone 2, to interval training?
Yeah, I know. I've heard of this. This topic is getting a lot of play in the socials and whatnot. And I got to be honest with you, Tony, the answer is no. And we just haven't seen a lot. We even did a study with MiraCare, a fertility tracker, where we were looking at the various different hormonal response. We had 10 amazing subjects in that study that measured on a daily basis their hormonal fluctuations by urinating on this pee stick that comes with the fertility tracker with MiraCare. And we really didn't see much at all. Little bit of change with heart rate variability towards the end of the cycle where you get the higher levels of progesterone. But in general, the long and the short of it for me, we don't see a whole lot of difference in the recommendations for males versus females. And I know that that's not clear across the chatter that's out there right now, because people tell me, not that I'm on it, but I've heard that's the case. But yeah, and ultimately, with respect to the symptoms of the menstrual cycle at various times, I make adjustments for my athletes there. And when I'm talking about the athletes that I've worked with, many of these are women that have gone to the Olympics and World Championships, and they're world beaters. And so there's some slight modifications that are made in accordance with that context. But in general, even down to fasted training or anything, with a healthy athlete, that's not too much difference across the genders from myself, in my experience.
And that's been my experience, but it's also been the experience of numerous coaches that you deal with the athlete that's in front of you, and gender is not really a big deciding factor in its adaptation or its response. And I think what has given me cause for pause is that many females have been warned off zone 2 exercise in favor of HIIT. And when you open the hood and you look at the research, it's research that's been done on rodents. And we've got studies in females that look at mitochondrial adaptation and metabolic adaptation, and they respond just similarly to men. And I just wonder why there's this fear-mongering amongst women who are now being warned off a really potent exercise stimulus, and then potentially exercising always in the red zone, whether it's weight training or interval training, but there's no easy work anymore, or very little of it for unjust reasons. So you haven't seen any data or experience working with women that would warn you off doing lower intensity steady state work?
No, just the contrary. That it's nothing but absolutely positive and substantially influential in terms of enhancing the training adaptation and performance when done correctly. And that's even really no different. And I'm talking like fasted rides, 5 to 6 hours in females, same as we do with the males. No difference really, and nothing but associated enhanced performance. And these gals will eat the house down just like us guys once those fasted rides are over. So it's never restricting calories. I know there is, like you said, a lot of chat and fear mongering on reds and these sorts of things, but it's like the human body, whether female or male, was meant to do hard work, to move long distances. Yeah, that DNA is within all of us, irrespective of the gender. I don't think the women were only just sitting at home and caring with the kids if we take an evolutionary biology perspective. That is my opinion and my experience, Tony. And again, I'm a scientist, so I'm open to all data, but I'm not aware of any reason not to sort of prescribe as I'm doing right now.
Well, let's use this as our final question. And it's another area where women have been scared off exercising before breakfast. And the reason for this is that it's supposedly females have different hormonal response or reproductive hormone responses, different cortisol levels, that when you exercise prior to breakfast, and sometimes even walking has been recommended to be avoided. So you should eat and then walk. And what we understand is then you are never in a state where you can oxidize fat as a fuel source if you're always exercising in a fed state. And I'm just not aware of any research, and I've gone looking, that there's such gender differences with respect to feeding and exercise. And I know that you are an advocate of doing some exercise fasted. We can use this also as a discussion to talk about different nutritional approaches, being lower carb, higher fat, how this affects females. But you've trained enough women to know if there's a signal for detriment. So let's talk about training in the fasted state. What are you hoping to achieve from it? And are you seeing anything negative? And do you ameliorate that in any way?
Yeah, so the purpose of the fasted training is to prolong usually it's almost the fasted window, to lower the level of insulin ultimately that you're under. In the contrasted state that you mentioned, where you eat as soon as you wake up, you're breaking that fast, and you're all of a sudden you're adding glucose of some sort, you're increasing glucose, and then insulin has to counter that, right? So all of a sudden when insulin is up, now you're in an anabolic state, and therefore you're in a state of building, right? So the body is now told to build. It needs to shut down fat metabolism. We don't want to waste that. We're going to store it, right? Yeah, you're in a sort of a storage mode, and that's not conducive to the exercising and using fat, which is, we've spoken at length on the podcast about the importance of that. So to me, that's quite sort of detrimental, and it all revolves around that key hormone insulin that is signaling whether we're in either the anabolic or the catabolic state. So you're immediately clamping on that, and then you're going to blunt the fat oxidation response. Yeah.
What kind of performances have you seen in females in a fasted state? So you've mentioned several hours. So what would be some of the upper limits you've seen fasted training?
So yeah, some of my athletes up to 6-hour rides. Yeah, no problem.
Astonishingly impressive.
Yeah, it is. When you're in that space, it's not that big a deal, and some of the anecdotal comments from these athletes when they break past this 2-hour barrier, like they get stronger and stronger as they go. And there's some fascinating work that's being done by Tim Noakes, Phil Prinz, Andrew Kutnick, and others that are really looking at this new concept really around just the only importance really is protection of the blood glucose. That's really the key thing that you need, preventing a hypoglycemia during exercise. And in the past, we've thought that it's all about sparing glycogen, and that's the kind of the key mark, but that's sort of out the window now. And that's at least the data that I'm seeing is it's really, you only need enough. And Philip Prince showed this in a recent publication in AJP Cell, where they fed both high carb adapted and fat adapted athletes. They fed them only 10 grams of carbohydrate per hour, very little, 3 grams per 20-minute stint ultimately. And that was all that was needed to maintain hypoglycemia, maintain the blood glucose level, and enhance performance. And they compared that to a placebo, right? That's all that was needed. I think our stance on and our belief around exercise, training, performance, and carbohydrates, and certainly the reliance on them, is really changing. That narrative is changing now.
And how would you view that approach in the world of people who lift weights for interval training? And I know one of your colleagues and friends, Dan Plews, has made the transition from Ironman to High Rocks. And as I understand it, is essentially using the same high fat, low carb approach to an event that's all above 90% of his heart rate max for an hour. In the past, you would say he would need X amount of carbohydrate, hundreds of grams. And I work in a world where 300 to 500 grams of carbs a day for people who train an hour a day is considered the norms. And then
How much?
yeah, 300 to 500 grams. Yeah. So it's a different world. And in this whole new
Sure.
concept or paradigm of low carb, high fat, how do you see it working for stochastic, intermittent resistance training or interval training folks?
See it working absolutely fine again, because the only thing that's required, again, from the data that I'm seeing, is the maintenance of the blood glucose level. If your blood glucose level is homeostatic, maintained, you have everything on board already stored to be able to function. And again, this is because we separate the small glucose pool from the large glucose pool. That large glucose pool it's protected, and the only time that is getting sorted is when you sleep at night. And that's why the Jeff Volek faster study showed this as well, right? We had high carb and low carb athletes in that doing a 3-hour run on the treadmill, and the glycogen level in both of those groups was identical. Didn't matter if they were ketogenic or if they were high carb. They had the exact same blood glucose, and that's because your body sorts it all out through the evening. And and again, according to it, just the adaptation process takes a lot longer. And that's what the studies haven't seen in the
And how
past.
long would you expect that to take if people are thinking of using a lower carb, higher fat approach?
Yep.
What would your advice be for give it X amount of weeks before you return back to a normal level of performance?
Yeah, so it ranges. And again, the Prince et al. Study was fantastic in displaying this, but the adaptation period takes between 3 and 6 weeks, depending on the individual. The more endurance trained you are, probably the faster you're going to be able to adapt over.
And what kind of carbohydrate per day numbers would you be recommending as a starting place?
Oh, well, I mean, it's wherever you can kind of start. It takes a while to sort of get started on the whole process, but because you got to, generally speaking, you need to usually sort of clear out the cupboard and sort of get away from ultimately processed food, usually in the first and foremost. And then it's good to, I think, probably go a little bit cold turkey in the beginning, so more actually towards the lower limits, and then make sure you maintain your salt level, because you'll be shedding salt because your insulin level will be all over the place. It's super low, and salt sheds as a result, and that develop the keto flu. But then afterwards, you can bring some back. You develop this metabolic flexibility ultimately, and it's no big deal.
And so how much carbohydrate would you consume in a day?
Me, I'm probably less than 100. Yeah.
Would you recommend using a CGM to
Yes.
guide? Yeah, okay. And what kind of
Because of the education that you get, and that's
right?
the amazing thing. So I just had a friend that did this, and that's really why he loved the CGM so much. So CGM, continuous blood glucose monitor, and what the thing is, like, he just wasn't aware that certain practices, or like dietary practices, or even certain stress levels, certain circadian rhythm issues were causing his blood glucose to spike. Remember, if blood glucose is spiking, then the insulin is usually tracking pretty close to that, right? And then that's so yeah, it's made a massive difference in his life, made a massive difference in mine too. And one of the most profound ones for me was I was working at High Performance Sport New Zealand, the Olympic program there, and I got I was just sitting there fasted, but I got a nasty email from accounting, and I was so angry, I was so pissed off about the email, and then I looked at my glucose monitor, and I'm like, what is happening? And it's like, it's spiking way up there, right? And that's because, of course, cortisol is a glucocorticoid, right? So the cortisol in my body from the high stress that I was under all of a sudden was spinning out, and my liver was spitting out all this glucose. Well, of course, that's a problem, right?
Problem. Paul, thank you. It's not common that we can get access to a leading coach, a leading scientist in the space of endurance training, interval training, health. So I appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks, Tony.
I'm an staunch listener of your podcast. I've read your textbook multiple times and use it as a reference. Where can people access you, your work? Tell us all.
Perfect. Yeah. Hey, well, again, it's just been an honor to be on your platform, Tony. I really wish you luck with this podcast. I hope it goes really well. You're a great host. I can tell you've got the natural gift for this. So I hope you continue on. And I guess you can find me usually on the internet. It's not too hard to find me, but one of my key things right now is all about Athletica.ai and trying to really provide many of the items that Tony and I've spoken about to everyone out there, right? And endurance athletes and just everyone, general public as well. And we've spoken a lot on the podcast about nutrition. We're actually running we're calling it the field research. And it's like a research project that anyone can participate in. And so just go to Athletica and you'll see the field research there. And you basically fill out a questionnaire about your diet for 10 to 15 minutes. Sign up for a free trial on Athletica, and you do have to have a wearable like a Garmin system, and we're going to compare the exercise data with your dietary practice. Can be whatever. You can be high carb, mid carb, low carb, whatever, but we just want to really get a large picture in the research on that across the world. And we're hoping for as many people on that study as we can get. Fantastic. Irrespective of your beliefs, honestly, we just come and join the study.
Great. I'll put it out there in my circles as well. Paul, thank you very much for your time and your expert insights. Appreciate you.
Thanks again, Tony. All the best.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you found today's episode as valuable as I did. If you're interested in going deeper into the science of how women respond to training and how to actually apply that in the real world, I'd love to invite you to join me for the Science of Thriving. It's a 9-week course I've created for both coaches and individuals, combining the latest science and research with lessons from over 30 years of coaching. You can head to the Science of Thriving to learn more and sign up. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next week in the next episode.